This is lecture 8 for Biology 178, covering endocrine system 3. This is the third part of the endocrine system where we will cover the pancreas, the adrenal glands, and also finishing up with the gonads, meaning the testes and the ovaries. We'll start with the pancreas. The pancreas has 99% of its volume dedicated to exocrine function. Exocrine means that it is released into the outside environment. This is, of course, meaning the digestive tract. The clusters of cells that perform this function are called the pancreatic acinnae, and they are attached to different ducts throughout the pancreas. They secrete an alkaline, enzyme-rich fluid. This is going to aid in the process of digestion as it is secreted through the pancreatic duct and through what we will come to learn is the duodenal papillae. However, 1% of the overall volume of the pancreas is endocrine function related. These are going to be small groups of hormone-producing cells scattered in clusters called pancreatic islets, or the islet of Langerhans. So first at the top, we can see where the pancreas sits. It's actually going to be deep to and slightly inferior to the stomach, so it'll be just in front of that. And the pancreas sits wedged directly into the first portion of the small intestine called the duodenum. We can see the pancreatic duct in the central portion of the body of the pancreas. Now, if we zoom in to the histological view, we can see the pancreatic acinnae. The pancreatic acinnae are going to be covering all the way around the pancreatic islet. The islet will appear lighter in its overall stained appearance as opposed to the acinnae. Now, what hormones are produced by the endocrine portion of the pancreatic islets? Well, the first is going to be glucagon. Glucagon is produced by the alpha cells of the islets, and its function is to raise blood glucose levels. It, of course, is going to respond when the body has low blood glucose levels. Insulin is the opposite of glucagon. It is produced by the beta cells of the islet, and it lowers blood glucose levels. So when blood glucose levels are too high, like you had a real big meal, a lot of sugar, insulin will be triggered to lower it. Glucagon would, of course, activate when you're starved or have very low blood sugar. Other two hormones that are produced are going to be somatostatin. This is going to help to control the different glucagon and insulin levels in the body. And then pancreatic polypeptides. These are going to regulate pancreatic gallbladder activity. We won't be talking about them more than what we covered right now. We'll be focusing on insulin and glucagon. So here we can see a pancreatic islet. We can see the alpha cells that are going to be in yellow, the beta cells there in orange. We have F cells and delta cells as well, with the pancreatic acinnae surrounding the pancreatic islet. When maintaining your blood sugar levels or glucose homeostasis, insulin and glucagon are the primary hormones that control these levels, and they have, of course, opposing effects. As blood glucose rises, beta cells will secrete insulin, and this stimulates the transport of glucose into the target cells by opening receptors in these cells. As blood glucose declines, alpha cells will secrete glucagon. This stimulates glycogen breakdown and glucose release. Normal blood glucose levels are between 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter of blood. If we increase our blood glucose levels beyond that, we will then trigger insulin release from the pancreas. The effects of insulin are as follows. It will increase the rate of glucose transport into the target cells, increase the rate of glucose utilization and ATP generation, increase conversion of glucose to glycogen, increase amino acid absorption and protein synthesis, and increase triglyceride synthesis in the adipose tissue. All of these are very key. So the major functions are going to be that it's going to actually force glucose into the tissue, make it convert to energy faster, and also make sure that it stores better. So it's going to be converted to glycogen more. Additionally, it's going to stimulate growth. Insulin itself is very much promotes growth of the body. So it's going to facilitate protein synthesis and then storage into fat as well. Once it performs all these functions enough to bring blood glucose levels down, we thereby restore homeostasis. Now, if we skip a meal or where our blood sugar is very low, then our alpha cells will secrete glucagon as blood sugar is too low. Glucagon has the following effects. It will increase the breakdown of glycogen to glucose in the liver and skeletal muscle where glycogen is stored. It will increase the breakdown of fat to fatty acids, so it's breaking down your adipose tissue to release the fatty acids and thereby actually the third step, increasing synthesis and release of glucose in the liver. So glucagon is actually going to break down all of the stored sugars in your muscle and liver, and additionally, it's going to take the fat cells, break those down, and start to convert those fatty acids into usable glucose. Remember, the liver itself is actually capable of building new sugars. Your body needs some form of sugar in order to function, and if it's not getting it from carbohydrate, then it will break down fatty acids or in some cases proteins and create new sugars out of those through a process called gluconeogenesis. Once all of these things have happened and your blood sugar elevates, thereby your homeostasis is restored. So now you can see the antagonistic and homeostatic relationship between insulin and glucagon. Now, a lot of people abuse this system over time through periods of starvation and then periods of mass consumption. And if you start to overuse the mechanisms, specifically of insulin, you tend to break things down a little bit and you can break the system. We call this condition diabetes. Diabetes mellitus is characterized by glucose concentrations that are high enough to overwhelm kidney reabsorption. So you get kind of a honey urine. It's where your urine is going to smell very sweet. Now, this can be caused by genetic abnormalities or mutations resulting in either inadequate insulin production, synthesis of bad insulin, or production of defective insulin receptor proteins. So you're either not making it, you're making it wrong, or your body's not able to use what is made. Now, the characterization of that glucose concentration can have hyperglycemia, presence of abnormally high blood glucose levels, glycosuria, where we have glucose in the urine, or polyuria, so excessive urine production. Typically, you'll have one or all three of these with respect to diabetes. There are, of course, two types of diabetes. The first type of diabetes used to be called just juvenile diabetes, but is now called type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is insulin dependent and typically very early onset. You're usually born with this. It's often develops in children and young adults. It can, however, happen due to injury or some sort of accident that can occur. And type 1 diabetes is where your body does not produce enough insulin from the beta cells. You usually need to receive insulin injections daily through either a syringe that you inject or from an insulin pump device. These look like small pagers or little devices that they hook onto you, and they have a tube that goes into you and constantly measures your blood sugar. It acts as an external pancreas. Only about 5 to 10% of all diabetes cases are type 1 diabetics. The other type of diabetes used to be called adult onset diabetes, but is now called type 2 because we found it with children. Type 2 diabetes is the most common form of diabetes mellitus, making up approximately 90% of all diabetes cases. You typically produce normal amounts of insulin. However, your receptors are not working properly. So the insulin that you have, you can't use. This is why this condition is often called insulin resistance. This type of disease is often associated with obesity and other chronic diseases. Type 2 diabetes can be treated with diet, exercise, and different medications that alter the rate of glucose synthesis and release by the liver. From the pancreas, we are now moving to the adrenal glands, or the suprarenal glands. The suprarenal glands are located and attached to the superior border of the kidneys, hence why they're called suprarenal. They're above the renal glands. The suprarenal glands, or adrenal glands, are made up of two parts: the medulla and the cortex. Here we can see the kidneys with an adrenal gland on top of each one of the kidneys. If you ever undergo a kidney transplant surgery or you donate a kidney, you are also donating an adrenal gland as well. Now, if we look inside the adrenal gland, we can see the cortex is going to be the outer layer covered by a capsule, and the medulla would be the inner neural layer. Now, the adrenal gland layers consist of course, the capsule, which is a thin outer connective tissue, and then the adrenal cortex, which is the outer region. The adrenal cortex is going to produce more than 24 steroid hormones, collectively known as corticosteroids. They affect metabolism of target cells and are vital to maintaining life. A lot of autonomic functions are regulated by these hormones. The adrenal medulla is the inner region and produces epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are involved in the sympathetic nervous system response. The adrenal cortex is actually broken up into a few separate layers. The outermost layer is called the zona glomerulosa. The next layer is called the zona fasciculata, and the innermost layer of the adrenal cortex is the zona reticularis. Each one of these layers is going to release different types of compounds. An easy way to remember this is glomerulosa is salt, zona fasciculata is sugar, and zona reticularis is sex. So as I stated earlier, the medulla is going to produce epinephrine and some norepinephrine, which of course is going to be stimulated by sympathetic nervous system. The cortex has those three layers, going from superficial to deep. There's the zona glomerulosa, the salt layer, which produces aldosterone, or a mineral corticoid that is involved in the reabsorption of salts. There's the next layer, which is zona fasciculata, sugars. This is the intermediate layer, which produces glucocorticoids like cortisol. Glucocorticoids increase glucose production and are involved in the stress response. And finally, the zona reticularis, or sex layer, is adjacent to the medulla and produces androgens like testosterone. More important in women than men because men produce androgens in the testes. Here's another great view of each one of the layers. Another way to remember the layers could be based upon how they look from a histological view. After the capsule, we move into the cortex. Zona glomerulosa is known as the zone of balls because the clusters of cuboidal cells actually cluster together in a ball or circular shape. Zona fasciculata is the zone of sticks, as they all tend to merge together in a stick-like pattern. Zona reticularis is actually called the zone of mesh, where they start to space out a little bit more towards the bottom and have very distinct rows in between them. Now, production of the adrenal and gonadal steroids is dependent upon cholesterol, seen here. All steroid hormones are made of cholesterol. Now, this is either consumed from the diet or produced by the body. Cholesterol is converted to pregnenolone, seen here. Pregnenolone can either move into one of two interlinked pathways. The progesterone pathway, where it can be converted into aldosterone or cortisol, or the DHEA pathway. DHEA is dihydroepiandrosterone. The production of sex hormones is dependent upon the secretion of this compound, which is the most abundant steroid in the human adult. It is produced by the adrenal glands, gonads, and brain, and serves as a precursor to the sex hormones, but has some activity on its own, mostly as a neurosteroid involved in the formations of memory. From DHEA, it would be converted to androstenedione and to either estrone or testosterone, based upon the pathway that is needed and what the body is commanding for. Testosterone, of course, can be converted out into a few other things, but you can see primarily how cholesterol is going to be converted into either aldosterone, cortisol, or the androgens. So salt, sugar, and sex from our different layers of the actual adrenal cortex. So I know there's three layers in the adrenal cortex, and I've mentioned aldosterone, cortisol, and then the androgens. We will be talking about aldosterone more when we get to the urinary system, so we're going to skip over that for now. We're also going to talk a little bit more about the androgens, testosterone, when we get to the testes portion of this lecture, and more so when we get to the reproductive section towards the end of 178. So we're going to focus right now on really just one hormone of the adrenal cortex. This is produced at the zona fasciculata layer, and that is cortisol. Cortisol, remember, is a glucocorticoid, which means it affects glucose handling. It has enhanced release during stress, and it is absolutely required for life. The overall function is to prevent hypoglycemia to ensure sufficient energy for body processes. Now, this diagram should look somewhat familiar, being that it would look like the thyroid gland. You can see this is going to be that negative feedback loop that is initiated by the hypothalamus. But this is going to be for the hormone cortisol. Remember, it always starts with an initial stimulus. In this case, what did we say the stimulus for cortisol is? Being stressed out. So as you have a longer term stress response, the hypothalamus will release corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH acts upon the anterior pituitary gland to produce adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. This will act upon the adrenal cortex, specifically zona fasciculata, to produce cortisol. As cortisol is activated, it's going to have a variety of overall effects, primarily, of course, raising blood glucose levels. And as once the blood glucose levels are elevated and stress goes away, it will then shut off the cortisol response. But if stress maintains, cortisol release will keep going. And this is why prolonged cortisol release can actually be detrimental to many people's health. So remember what I said is that cortisol is essential for life, and without it, we could die when exposed to environmental stressors. We wouldn't be able to handle stress. The most important function of this glucocorticoid is to prevent hypoglycemia by ensuring that there are sufficient fuel supplies for metabolism. However, it does other stuff. First off, it's going to promote gluconeogenesis, so the creation and production of glucose in the liver. It's going to break down skeletal muscle for fuel because skeletal muscle is made of proteins. We can use these proteins to actually keep the body running. We can break down fats for fuel as well. We get a suppressed body immunity because that's going to use up more unnecessary energy that we can't use to deal with the stress that we're handling. Our body is going to break down bones to use calcium for other processes. It's going to alter brain function, specifically by increasing anxiety, having violent mood changes, and increased hostility or anger. The last overall function, not listed here on the slide, is going to increase the production of red blood cells in the bone marrow. So we can see all of the effects of cortisol can actually be detrimental to the body if performed for too long. This is why it's important to find ways to de-stress the body. Otherwise, you start to break things down to the extreme. Now, a disease of hypersecretion of glucocorticoids when they happen for too long is called Cushing's disease. Cushing's disease can be caused by pituitary gland tumor or just general hypersecretion. And here, lipid reserves are mobilized to where adipose tissue accumulates in the cheeks and at the base of the neck, but spares the limbs. It leaves you with a moon face appearance, striae often on the abdomen as well as elsewhere. They look like stretch marks, and red facial splotching that is caused by the dilation of the arterioles. So here we can see a sample of what happens with Cushing, and hypercortisolism causes obviously emotional disturbance, an enlarged cell turcica, because again, your pituitary gland is going to be hypersecreting ACTH to affect the overall adrenals. You could get moon face from excessive adipose tissue gathering, osteoporosis, cardiac hypertrophy. You get a buffalo hump appearance from fat storage, increased obesity. You can have thin, wrinkled skin, abdominal striae, amenorrhea, muscle weakness, different skin ulcers and the like. So it's the body effectively breaking down from hypercortisol release over time. The final endocrine glands that we'll cover in this class are going to actually be reproductive glands primarily. So we'll just briefly talk about the hormones that they release, and we'll cover these two glands more when we get to the reproductive system towards the end of this class. The first are the testes, and these produce androgens, the most important one being testosterone. In males, they are produced by the testes, and in both sexes, small amounts are produced in the suprarenal glands. The androgens are required for development of male genitalia, and testosterone is necessary for the production of active sperm, as well as the male secondary sex characteristics of the general male body shape, which is a narrower hips and typically broader shoulders, body and facial hair, muscular development, thickening of the vocal cords, and behavioral effects such as increased sex drive and aggression. The ovaries for women are actually going to produce estrogen and progesterone. These are produced primarily in the ovaries, but during pregnancy, the placenta also produces large amounts of female sex hormones. These sex hormones are required for the ovarian cycle and menstruation, and they are necessary for the development of normal female sexual organs and tissues. They are also essential to support the development of a fetus during pregnancy. In addition, these hormones are going to contribute to the female secondary sex characteristics such as breast development and female pattern of fat deposition, to where we actually have the fat go into the hips and upper thighs. Now, however, there are other secondary sexual characteristics in females that are actually governed by androgens from where these are produced from the suprarenal gland. These, of course, would be pubic and armpit hair growth as well as sex drive.